Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I'll be the host for today's program. With me, as usual, is Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western Michigan also, and Associate Director of the Lewis Walker Institute for Race and Ethnic Relations. We should get that.
Yeah, get Lewis Walker.
Plug in the great work that the Walker Institute does. And as I usually say, Don moonlights at another job, and that is being a Kalamazoo City Commissioner. So, Don, always good to see you.
Good to see you, Ron.
And we have a very special guest with us this time around, and that's Jerry Berrigan. Jerry is a graduate of Kalamazoo College and one of the co-founders of Peace House here in Kalamazoo, which is a Catholic worker house. And they do a really great job of working with kids on the east side of Kalamazoo. So, Jerry, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm sort of surprised we haven't had you on the program before.
Yeah.
We've had
Here
your
we are
sister
now.
on.
Here
and
we are now.
We've had your sister on. And I actually did a show with your mom and dad way back when I was doing the other show at Western, WMU Forum. So you're the last person in the family to get on the show, I guess.
That's right. That's right.
We should have had you before. Well, we have some very serious issues to talk about today. Before we get into the questions concerning nuclear weapons, which is what we want to talk about, and resistance to nuclear weapons, I want you to talk a little bit about Peace House, though. I'm not sure everybody out there really knows exactly what Peace House is and
Sure.
what kind of great work you guys do. So why don't you talk a little bit about Peace House for us?
Yeah. Peace House is a community in the Catholic worker movement. We've been open in Kalamazoo's East Side neighborhood since 2009. I'm kind of co-founder, co-director, along with three other people, my wife, Molly Mechtenberg, and our friends Jen and Mike DeWale. And we were all classmates from Kalamazoo College in 1997. While at K College, we all kind of were able to discern that our life's calling and our kind of great enthusiasm, if you will, would be in the work for peace and justice somehow. So that passion and that enthusiasm led us right after graduation to various communities in the Catholic worker movement, which was founded in 1933 in New York City by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, with the idea that the Christian Gospels are to be incarnated, right? That they are to be lived. That this is a text, kind of a script for actors, right? Mm-hmm. So when we are called to get into like radical sharing with people who have nothing, that's not just sermon material. That's life material, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And that so Dorothy Day and Peter Morin began feeding the poor. Welcoming them into their homes as guests, as friends, indeed as Jesus, because we believe that everyone has a spark of the divine within them. And they began publishing a newspaper in which they kind of articulated this promise of things being not just a little bit better, but much, much better, right? Because we have a fabulous opportunity in this life to do something good and to do something great, right? And the idea caught on. Indeed, the theology behind it was quite sound and deeply rooted in kind of a lot of thought about the nature of God and people that goes back many hundreds of years. And Catholic worker communities started sprouting up all over the United States. Another portion of the Catholic worker witness is a strict adherence to pacifism. Jesus told Peter to put down the sword and taught us to love our enemies and to figure out ways of settling our conflicts without killing one another. Dorothy and Peter took that very seriously, which, during World War II and other times during the Korean War and so forth, made the Catholic worker pretty unpopular in America. Membership declined, donations declined, houses closed, and quite simply, the position was always no to war, no to war. And not only rhetorically, but also this was a position that they took into the streets. So some of the first people to burn their draft cards as an act of protest during the Vietnam War were Catholic workers. Right? And so anyway, Peace House grounds itself in that tradition. The Catholic worker movement is still very much alive. There are 130 plus communities worldwide, of which we are one. So we located ourselves in the east side neighborhood of Kalamazoo, where, according to numbers from the Lewis Walker Institute, some 59% of children live in poverty. We did so after having coffee with Don Cooney, who gave us an overview of Kalamazoo because we were moving back to this town where we had lived as students. And Don said, you know, if you want to work with kids, the east side really needs that presence. And that was very good advice. We're grateful to you, Don.
Boy, you guys have made such a difference over there, Jerry. Terrific.
Yep. So through the school year, we run a tutoring program out of our two homes. We live next door to each other, and we have volunteers come in and help kids with their homework. We provide a healthy snack every day. We're open for 2 hours in the late afternoon. If the weather's favorable, we'll play outside. And then in the summertime, we do a big summer program. We're looking at, for the summer of 2014, being open 8 weeks, 3 hours a day, 4 days a week, and just coming up with positive programming for kids and trying to meet them where they are, and trying to provide enough of a range of activities so that there's something there for everyone. So we're going to be doing summer camps based on everything from nature writing to bike repair, and we're going to be doing sports programming, again working with Don and others on that. Yeah, so that's much of what we're trying to do in the East Side neighborhood.
Sounds great. And so let's transition to the Plowshares movement, which actually fits in very well, grows out of that same tradition.
Sure.
And so why don't you talk a little bit about the whole concept of Plowshares, resistance to nuclear weapons, and Plowshares actions, and then we'll talk about a very specific action that took place not too long ago that resulted in a recent prison sentence for 3 people that you know very well. So
yeah. Well, I'm going to back up a little bit, even to before the first Plowshares action. I was raised in Baltimore by Philip Berrigan and Elizabeth McAllister, who were both former vowed Catholic religious, and they had met and fallen in love kind of towards the end of the Vietnam War era. At which time they had both kind of become convinced that this war was completely unconscionable and needed to be resisted by people of conscience, by any nonviolent means, right? And the means that spoke to them most deeply were kind of means that grew out of their Catholic theology and grounded, I think, in the witness of Jesus in his confrontation with the worldly powers of his day. In other words, nonviolent civil disobedience was understood as a Christian responsibility when you're dealing with an empire and its wars. Okay, and so before I was even born, my father had spent some 3 years in federal prison for various acts of nonviolent civil disobedience, which included property destruction, but did not include any violence to any people. So in 1973, my parents founded a community in Baltimore called Jonah House, which had as its bases scripture study, voluntary poverty, and a sustained commitment to resisting American wars and nuclear weapons. Which by that point, you know, the nuclear stockpile of our country had grown to a point where we were dealing with overkill global, right? So, you know, we possessed enough nuclear weapons in our stockpile, and we still do, to kill everyone on the planet many times over and poison it permanently, right?
I think at one point the stockpile worldwide was 60 to 70,000 nuclear weapons.
Right.
I think it got to that point at one point. We've scaled back considerably since then, but we still possess overkill.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you know, every stage of nuclear activity, from mining to processing to producing weapons, to having the weapons sitting there, to finally disposal of waste, every stage leaks radioactive material into the ecosphere. Not to mention testing, right? So you know, even if the weapons are never used, we're dealing with you know, global increase in cancer rates, and local, if you want to call them hotspots, of intensely contaminated places, of which Oak Ridge is one. And we'll talk about that again in a minute. So, you know, none of this really happened with any kind of a public conversation, right? You had people in Washington who were making decisions based out of fear, and you know, a lot of that happened long before I was born, right? But there it is. So my father and mother and my Uncle Daniel and some other people began talking in the late 1970s about, you know, what is to be done with the fact that we've got all these nuclear weapons. They're on a hair trigger alert, right? One person, the President of the United States, could initiate a nuclear war based on a whim or whatever, right? And the future of the world kind of hangs in the balance. What do people do with that, you know? And when they were wrestling with something difficult, they usually began to engage in some Bible study. And on one day, they opened up the book of Isaiah to chapter 2 and read that people will beat their swords into plowshares. And they said, how about that? How about that? What would it look like if people beat their swords into plowshares? You know, the government's not going to do it, right? So maybe it's the responsibility of the people to do it. And in September of 1980, 8 people entered a General Electric manufacturing plant in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philly, and found 2 nose cones for the Mark 12A, which is it was a multiple. It's an MIRV. These were nuclear warheads, right? And they beat on them with household hammers and poured blood on them.
There were multiple.
Right.
That could bear up, you know.
Right. Re-entry vehicles, they called them, which is a great military euphemism. And they beat on them with household hammers and poured blood on them, knowing that this would result in years in prison. And indeed it did.
I think they had to call the police themselves, didn't they?
Not on that one.
Not
There have been times where that had to happen, but not on that one. They only had a couple of minutes where they were actually working on the things. So thus the plowshares movement was born. So as the 2 superpowers were kind of squaring off with each other, there grew this kind of movement in this tradition of radical nonviolent resistance in the United States, saying we're not part of this at all. You know, in fact, we're so opposed to it that we're going to place our bodies in the way. We're going to resist this insanity. We're going to place our bodies in the way nonviolently. And many people, I mean, this is your field, criminology, have studied international law and the treaties to which the United States is bound, and have used language in their statements about like removing their complicity from this ongoing crime. Right.
Exactly.
And indeed, even as we sit here talking, I mean, we're complicit under Nuremberg in our government's crimes. You know, so you know, since that time, many scores of plowshares actions have happened. Most have been in the United States. Some have been in Europe. And some in Australia and New Zealand. And one of the most recent was in Oak Ridge in August of 2012, where 3 people whom I know, Sister Megan Rice, who's now 82 years old, and Greg Borchi Obed, who's a a house painter, a Catholic worker, and a father of a college-age daughter. From Duluth, Minnesota, Michael Wally from Washington, D.C., also a Catholic worker of many years.
Both of them are veterans as well, right?
Yes, they are. Yep. Entered the Y-12 nuclear facility at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and made their way by cutting a number of fences to a bunker which holds the largest stockpiled in the world of highly enriched weapons-grade uranium. And they spray painted some slogans on the side of the building and poured their own blood as, a statement about, what the product inside of this building will do. It will shed blood, and then also as kind of a gift, a sacrifice, to say we will sacrifice ourselves, so that this will maybe not continue. Their court proceeding took a fairly long time. They were ultimately convicted of sabotage, which is a felony charge for people who get in the way of the national defense, obstruct the national defense. And they were sentenced last month to very lengthy prison terms. Sister Megan Rice, at 82 years old, is looking at 36 months in prison. Greg and Michael each were given 62-month sentences, which is just over 5 years. Wow. And the two men have now landed at the federal penitentiaries where they will serve their time, and Sister Megan is still in transition. So.
Seems incredible. The plant there at Oak Ridge has been known as the Fort Knox of uranium because there is so much there, and this is the place where they actually make the thermonuclear cores for the warheads.
Yep.
So this is highly significant plant to carry out this kind of resistance action.
Indeed. Let me just say one more thing about Y-12. I mean, every nuclear bomb in the arsenal has parts in it that come from that plant. And it's part of a network of national laboratories, they're called, which are in places like Hanford, Washington, and Rocky Flats, Colorado. These are places where the nuclear weapons are made, in whole or in part. And each one of them is intensely contaminated with radiation. So the workers who work there, on the one hand, they've got good union jobs, they're making good wages, they've got health care and so forth. On the other hand, their health cannot be secured because they're around this material all the time. And the communities which neighbor these plants are also in jeopardy, right? They're downwind often, or the water is tainted.
Have there been any cases, Jerry, where people in the vicinity have developed diseases or anything, or is not sure? Or?
Well, I can't speak to it, but I don't see how you can avoid that.
Yeah, I think in all these places the cancer rates are much higher. At one point in the 80s, almost all of these places were shut down because of the massive radioactive contamination. My student David Kozlerich, who's now professor down at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville, when he was a graduate student, he did his doctoral dissertation on looking at these plants, and we later included that as a chapter in our book, Crimes of the American Nuclear State. So we argued that this was a form of state corporate crime because it almost always involved the government engaging in a contract with some private corporation to run these facilities, and then again there was this massive radioactive poisoning, the workers, the air, the water, the entire community. So for a long time all of them were pretty much shut down, and then gradually have been reopened and continued their work. And this theme of criminality, I think, is really an important theme. I mean, it's my entry into looking at this whole thing came as an activist, but then, as a criminologist, I couldn't help but also start to study it from that kind of a perspective. So that resulted in the work that Dave and I did. And I'm as a criminologist, I'm always interested in when people talk about these things, the use of the language of criminality to talk about them. And again, these are not people who are professional criminologists themselves, right? I mean, Sister Megan, I had to read her quote. She said, "We had to do it," she said. "We were doing it because we had to reveal the truth of the criminality which is there." That is our obligation. And again, she's not a trained criminologist. She's not saying that this is a crime in the sense that it violates a specific statute or anything. She's saying that in a broader symbolic sense that this is a morally blameworthy harm, to borrow some other criminological language.
Crime against humanity.
It's a crime against humanity. And in fact, other people have used that exact language. Ralph Hutchinson, who is one of the activists with the Oak Ridge Peace Alliance, and I think we've had some conversation about bringing Ralph up here, but he talks about their commitment to nonviolent social change, includes being present to say no, as Jerry was talking about, when the government is preparing for crimes against humanity. He actually using crimes against creation. So again, that language of criminality is used by the people who are engaged in the resistance actions and their supporters as well. And there's also an element of legal truth to what they say, because under international law, the United States is in fact engaged in a criminal act. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, which the United States has signed, and when, of course, once a treaty is signed according to the U.S. Constitution, it becomes, under the Supremacy Clause, part of the law of the United States, right? All treaties that are made become the supreme law of the land. So this is operative law, and by signing that agreement in 1968, what we said, along with the other nuclear powers at the time, is that, okay, if you guys don't develop nuclear weapons, right? We don't want these weapons to proliferate. If you guys don't do that, if you restrain yourselves, then we will pledge to get rid of our arsenals. We will move toward disarmament. So, I mean, this is a legal obligation. This is a legal obligation that the United States and the other nuclear powers undertook at that time. Now, of course, the rest of the world pretty much kept their bargain, with a few exceptions. The rest of the world kept their bargain. Now, the nuclear club has grown, right? It now includes India, Pakistan, and Israel, which none of those three signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So we've included those folks. And of course, now North Korea has a few also. They did initially sign and then withdrew. But for the most part, the rest of the world kept their end of the bargain, but the nuclear powers have not. And every 5 years, there is a review session for the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it's not like there's not an occasion to review the progress that's being made.
Yeah.
And yet, during the time when this treaty has been in effect, the arsenals have, well, they grew for a while, then they were scaled back by other agreements, but we still have, there's still around 17,000 nuclear weapons in the world today, some of which are active, some of which are stored intact. The United States and Russia each have around 7,000 to 8,000 of those weapons, and the other powers, if we add them all together, we can add another 1,000 to the arsenal. But the point is that neither Russia or the United States or any of the other nuclear powers have really made any steps toward complete abolition, which they're legally bound to do under the treaty. So when people said after the sentencing at Oak Ridge, well, the wrong criminals got convicted here, right? That I think there's a very strong element of truth. The United States government is in violation of international law by maintaining these facilities and attempting to modernize them, not taking the steps that they're required to do under this treaty to eliminate those weapons to disarm. And so the real criminals in this case are the government. And these are people who see a moral obligation to resist that criminality, and for that, then they become criminalized themselves.
Now, has Iran signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Yes.
So they go after Iran and say, well, you signed this treaty, so you can't do this.
Well,
But-
and even there, again, the treaty does allow, and this is a flaw in the treaty as far as I'm concerned, but it does allow for the enrichment of uranium. It does allow
Right.
for allow
Energy.
for nuclear power to be developed. So, you know, yes, but Iran has not technically violated the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so, yes, it's sort of, well, again, what we're talking about here is the concept that's been thrown out is nuclear apartheid, right?
Yeah, sure.
And of course, it's totally hypocritical. The nuclear powers say, well, you know, we have the weapons. We need the weapons for our
Right.
national defense. You can't have the
That's
weapon.
right.
You can't have even one weapon. If you develop one weapon, we're going to attack you. I mean, basically, that's what we said, right?
Yeah.
I mean, all options are on the table. Well, that's just, you know, language to say, you know, we're going to use military force against you if you continue down this path.
It's American exceptionalism again.
well, it
We're
is.
exception. from the
We're
rule.
exceptional. We can have nuclear weapons for our protection. We see it as for protection, and the rest of the world, or at least certain parts
Yeah.
of the world, are not allowed to. So there's a strong element of hypocrisy that's involved in all this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Jerry, I'm struck by how you present this case and how the media treats these things. They treat the Oak Ridge people as eccentrics who are just lacking in all common sense. But as you present the case, it's a whole different thing. And it strikes me how few people get the opportunity to hear the side that you present.
Yeah. There have been, the Oak Ridge Three have gotten pretty widespread media attention. And from the more major outlets, I would say they've gotten a pretty fair report of their story. But in any case, I mean, people, you know, nice people don't do those sorts of things.
Right.
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 I mean, it is a breach in business as usual, for sure. Right. And it's very countercultural, so it takes people a long time to kind of get into the mind state of, you know, why would somebody do something like that? In particular, in America, we value private property, you know, even ahead of human life in some cases, right?
Yeah,
And
certainly.
and this challenges that. Their argument says, among other things, some property has no right to exist. Some property, in fact, is improper. It is anti-proper because its sole mission, its sole purpose is destruction, and destruction on an unimaginable scale, right? So they're challenging kind of quite a bit of what, you know, we just kind of assume here in America to be
Yeah.
good and to be real and to be true. And yet, their act was designed, I think, among other things, to be kind of shocking, right? I mean, the use of blood against a building is a shocking symbol. People don't do that, you know. And yet, it hits people viscerally, and it makes them uncomfortable and makes them think, right? Yeah. I think another main goal of their action was to introduce the issue of nuclear weapons once again into the national conversation, right? And frankly, it's not in the national conversation,
Oh, no.
right? I mean, our politicians are talking about jobs, and they're talking about energy, and they're talking about these other things, which are very important. But in our day-to-day, American citizens forget that we have 7,000 some nuclear weapons that are ready to fly right now, you know. And we also forget that, you know, at these national laboratories, accidents do happen all the time. I read a book last summer written by someone who grew up next to the National Lab at Rocky Flats, and she was talking about playing in a stream bed where they dumped effluent from the plant, which was intensely radioactive, right? They'd go down, that was their swimming hole, right? And then fires broke out, and burned the roof off of the place and nearly went critical. I mean, they nearly had a nuclear explosion there, and they did have massive releases of radiation into the atmosphere, right? Fukushima, another thing, right?
Yeah.
I would encourage everyone who hears this program to think very carefully and to do research before they ever again eat Pacific fish, you know, because the radiation dump into the Pacific Ocean was so intense from that meltdown, which continues, right? They're not hoping to have that even contained for the next 40 years. They can't get in there, right? So, I mean, these are, you know, and then our local nuclear reactor, Palisades, you know, it seems like every 3-4 months they have to shut the thing down for yet another safety violation. You know, the people of West Michigan should be allowed to the table to talk about whether that plant should remain open. You know, if something happens, we all have to leave.
Yeah.
You know, if something like Fukushima happens there, we don't get to come back. So these are issues that require an informed, very deep public conversation, and we don't have that.
Not at all.
You know, so Greg and Michael and Sister Megan very definitely wanted to spark a national conversation about nuclear weapons and whether we should have them, and if so, how their use or non-use should be governed, right? Because currently, I mean, President Obama has the button, and let's hope he doesn't use it. Let's hope his successor doesn't use it. You know, where are we going? What's the future of the world going to look like? These are really critical questions, and they raise these questions with, you know, the next 3-5 years of their lives. It should be uncomfortable to us that good people are sitting in prison over this issue. It should inspire us to do more, you know, and I hope it does.
There have been many people that have participated in Plowshares Actions over the years, and we had a couple of them right here in our community, Gene and Joe Gump, live out in Bloomingdale. Our good friend Joe passed away last month, and we had a wonderful service, memorial service and tribute to him at St. Thomas a while back. But let's talk a little bit about Joe. Joe and Gene both participated in Plowshares Actions, both also served time in federal prison. Can you talk a little bit about your good friend Joe Gump and what a wonderful man he was?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you couldn't make this story up if they hadn't lived it first, you know. Joe and Gene were cradle Catholics. They grew up in the Chicago area. And
high school sweethearts.
High school sweethearts, yep. They raised 12 children in the Chicago suburbs. And Joe was an electrical engineer by trade. And you know, throughout their marriage and their life together, they were deeply concerned with social issues and social justice. So, you know, there's a family story where Jean was deeply concerned about racial justice, and she went off to march in Selma, Alabama, and Joe stayed home with the kids. You know, so here's Joe running a household with 12 kids. I mean, I don't know how they did it even one single day, much less if like one of them had to leave town or something, right? You get the kids on board with the work, I suppose, is the only way to go. But heroic, right? You go because this issue is so important. It's not safe for you, and it's not going to be easy for me. But you go and march for racial justice in the South, and they continued to be active, you know, in their parish and in local issues of justice in the Chicago area. By and by, all of their kids grew up and moved out, and began having grandchildren and so forth. And meanwhile, Jean especially was becoming deeply concerned about the issue of nuclear weapons and the potential of nuclear war. You know, I love my 12 kids. I love my grandchildren. I don't want to see their lives extinguished in a moment because of some political difficulty or something like that. This is insane, right? I'm going to do something about it. And she joined a a community which was contemplating a plowshares action, which they ultimately committed at a missile silo, I believe in Missouri. Their action was actually filmed by Mike Wallace and the 60 Minutes crew. Mike was, or 60 Minutes was doing a piece on plowshares, you know. And as it happens, I am also in that 60 Minutes report. I believe I was 9 or 10, or maybe 11. I was being questioned about my grades in there, which, you know, is not really my finest hour. But yeah, so while Gene was in prison for this action, Joe decided that it was time for him to do more for nuclear disarmament as well. And he and another man, Jerry Ebner, did a similar action at a missile silo in the Midwest as well. So Gene and Joe, at one point, were in federal prison at the same time. Yeah, and they got out, I believe, after they were released in 1990. They moved to a house they owned in Bloomingdale and rehabbed it as kind of their retirement home. And they've lived in this area ever since.
And became very involved with Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War.
Sure.
In the summer of 2002, when it became apparent that the Bush administration was going to invade Iraq, a group of people came together to start to protest the impending war. We met on campus at the Wesley Foundation. Joe and Gene were there, and it was Joe Gump's idea to call ourselves Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War. And again, I think just the choice of that name was very instructive, because it reflected Joe's philosophy of a deep commitment to nonviolence, which is part of the Plowshares movement, the Catholic worker tradition. And the fact that you have to take action, opposition. We are opponents to war. We're going to resist the war machine. He did it. He and Gene did it with their bodies. Others of us do it in other ways, but the fact is you have to take action. You have to resist. And what are you resisting? You're resisting war, empire, the violence of the state. And so again, I thought Joe's choice of the words Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War was really a great stroke of insight as to what we were all about, what he was all about. And so, Gene and Joe, and they were out there standing at vigils in front of the Federal Building long before the rest of the group started to do it. They were actually concerned about the situation in Iraq before the latest war, the result of the first Gulf War, and the sanctions that were imposed just led to horrible suffering on the part of the Iraqi people, and literally 500,000 to 1 million Iraqi children died as a result of those sanctions. And so they were standing out in front of the Federal Building protesting that. They made a trip to Iraq, I believe. And so they were very involved in that issue even before the rest of us started to think about Iraq, I think. And of course, with the 2003 invasion, they became part of Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War. And as many of our viewers know, KNOW stands outside the Federal Building every Sunday from noon to 1. And Gene and Joe were always there. And as long as Joe's health allowed him to do so, he was always there. And we will miss him greatly.
Yes, we will. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me, there's so many things that strike you about those two, but it didn't matter if there were 100 people out there or 5. They were going to do the witness, and they were doing it cheerfully, and they really believed in the power of truth and love, and they were out there witnessing to that every time.
Yeah,
it's powerful.
Yeah, yeah. They were strong mentors of our fledgling peace group at Kalamazoo College in the 1990s. You know, and you know, one of the things which drew us all to Gene and Joe Gump, and I knew them previously, of course, and you know, there was one point on campus where, in my freshman year, there was a showing of that 60 Minutes clip, and then Gene and Joe and I kind of took questions, right? But one, you know, what drew us all to Gene and Joe Gump so deeply was first the integrity of their witness. You know, we believe in peace and justice and some kind of a future worthy of the name for our planet, for our children, and for everyone we know, and for everyone else, and we're going to do what we can to help defend that, to help make that happen, coupled with their completely irrepressible personalities.
Yeah. Positive, always positive.
Positive, huge smiles.
Yeah.
Kindness, enthusiasm to meet new people and to be with them. Jean Gump is one of the funniest people around. She's just hilarious, right? Half the things she says will make you laugh out loud, right? So we as college students were drawn to that. I mean, these are people who are completely dyed in the wool, in love with life, right? And that animates everything that they do, and it animates everything that they are, So, and they would have us out and cook us really good food, and we would have these great evenings. And so certainly for the four of us at Peace House, having the witness of Jean and Joe Gump and having the relationship with them cannot be discounted in our life journey. They made the life of peace and justice work, not only seem possible, but they made it irresistible. How would you not want to be in league with people like that?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, we were so fortunate to have them in this area, that they chose to be out here. That was just such a blessing. And they were so strong over the years and so insightful in many of the ways that they saw through the smoke and fog and saw that deep to what was really going on.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah. Well, the Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War is talking about creating some kind of a scholarship in Joe's honor, and we're just beginning to discuss that, but certainly that will be happening, I know, at some point, and I'm sure there'll be many other ways that we can pay tribute to this wonderful man and the great work that he did. And of course, Jean is still in our presence, and we'll be providing as much support as we can to Jean. And I know Jean will be back out there on the lines as soon as she's able to do so.
She was there last Sunday.
Okay.
She was there Sunday.
Right back again. That's great. Well, we also lost another really incredibly dedicated peace activist recently. This is a person that I did not know personally. I don't think any of us knew him personally, but we certainly knew his work. The writer and peace activist Jonathan Schell passed away this week. Jonathan Schell was one of the most important figures in the revitalization of protests against nuclear weapons in the early 1980s. His book, The Fate of the Earth, was just an incredibly powerful book. It was a series of articles that he wrote for the New Yorker magazine and published as a book form. And what Schell was doing was looking at what would happen if this nuclear exchange takes place. What would be the fate of the Earth? What would be the fate of human civilization? And it's an unsparing, scathing look at this particular problem. And just an incredibly powerful book. It really helped to mobilize and animate the nuclear weapons freeze movement, I think, in the early 1980s, the resistance to the Reagan administration's actions. And of course, Jonathan Schell went on to continue to work on this issue. And I don't know if we can get a chance to get a shot of one of his latest books. Here we go.
Yeah, got it.
Most recent book, The Seventh Decade. And this was the seventh decade referred to the seventh decade in which nuclear weapons have been present in the world. And as one who's done a lot of work on this issue and written about it from a criminological perspective, I always found Schell's work to be just indispensable, providing perspective, some history, ideas about how we can deal with this issue. And so, again, I think if you wanted to read one book that kind of brought you up to speed on this particular issue, The Seventh Decade is one of those books that would do that, the new shape of nuclear danger, as Schell put it. And then another important book that Schell wrote that I think fits in so well, The Unconquerable World. And this is sort of a broad history in which he looks at state power, but also the profound ability of people through their movements and through nonviolent movements to resist state power. And so it's just a really great historical and philosophical examination of the power of nonviolence to resist state power. So,
And he frequently contributed to the Nation magazine, writing articles, keeping the issue on the agenda and keeping people up to date with the implications of what's going on. He's very helpful with that.
Yeah, he certainly did. He wrote a series of columns for the Nation after 9/11, which were collected together in another book called A Hole in the World. And very powerful writing. I think no one that I read after 9/11 was able to sort of step back and examine that particular incident and what it was doing to our country with the kind of philosophical depth and historical perspective and sense of balance that Jonathan Shell was able to bring to that issue. So just a remarkable man, a remarkable writer, and again, just a sad day that we've lost such a great presence in the peace community in this country and the world.
Absolutely, yeah. So Jerry, what do you see as next steps in the movement at this point?
Yeah. I think it's really important to remember that nuclear weapons are a part of the arsenal of the U.S. empire. Okay, it's really important to be familiar with what kind of numbers of weapons we have, the environmental consequences of their production and so forth, nuclear policy and so forth. But it's also important to see them as part of our imperial designs. You know, in my lifetime, our country has constantly been at war. And I say that literally. There has never been a time since 1975 when I was born when we have not been at war. And we're often involved in many places at once. You know, we have hundreds of military bases all over the globe. And that's what we've got, right? So I find it really important to try to say no to that as best we can, you know, and as faithfully as we can. Here in Kalamazoo, we've learned in the past year that there is a drone command wing coming to the Michigan Air National Guard base in Battle Creek. And again, I mean, drones are kind of a new weapon in our arsenal. And they keep our soldiers out of harm's way as we do surveillance and bombing missions in other parts of the globe, right? Violating the sovereignty and the kind of national, or the borders of other countries, right? Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so forth. The leaders of those countries have formally asked that we not do that.
Yeah,
Please
right.
don't send your remote-controlled airplanes into our country and bomb our people. If you could just stop doing that, we would appreciate it. You know, and so it's coming to our region. In early June, Peace House and Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War are working with a group called Voices for Creative Nonviolence out of Chicago to walk 163 miles from downtown Chicago, the headquarters of Boeing Aircraft, to the gates of the Michigan Air National Guard in Battle Creek. So we'll be coming through Kalamazoo in the second week of June, trying to raise awareness about that issue. Every night, the walk will stop at some town in, you know, Indiana or southwest Michigan, and enjoy hospitality there offered by local people. Give a talk about the issue. Many of the people on the walk have traveled to Pakistan and Afghanistan, some of them many times, and spoken with people who have suffered drone attacks, and who have told about that experience. You know, and you know, I think it's fair to say that if we don't want a remote-controlled airplane coming into our backyard, and dropping a bomb on our children, then we shouldn't do it to other people. That's basically the message.
Wow.
So we're inspired by what one bit of wisdom from the civil rights era. They said, "When in doubt, march." So we're hoping to organize this
great.
long march.
And that's early June.
It's early June. Yep.
Kathy Kelly will be involved, I'm
Yes.
sure.
Yep. Kathy Kelly's coming up to Kalamazoo in 2 days for a meeting to help plan this thing.
So what specific dates would the march be coming through Kalamazoo?
If it runs on schedule, I think we're looking at June 12th and 13th coming through town, maybe the 11th in there somewhere. June 3rd is the start date.
Okay.
And they're thinking 15 miles a day for 11, 12 days.
Okay. And if people, I mean, you're only starting to get organized now, but if people out there were interested in participating in the march in some way, shape, or form, how would they get in touch with you or the organizing?
Get a pencil and you can write down our phone number. 269-492-1206 is the number for Peace House. You could also find us on our website, Peace House, written together, PEACEHOUSE, KZOO.org. And from there you can send us an email. So peacehousekazu.org. You send us an email and we'll get you marching or supporting in some way, right?
All right, that sounds good.
That's great.
In talking about the international law aspects again, I mean, we talked about it just in general, that the possession of nuclear weapons violates international law, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that here what we're talking about is another form of international law, which is the laws of war. International humanitarian law is the formal term. Goes back to the 19th century, actually, with conferences that were held at The Hague and later in Geneva. And there's been a substantial development of this body of law over the years. And one of the hallmarks of international humanitarian law is the protection of civilians and non-combatants, so that military force cannot be used, cannot target specifically civilians, number one, but at the same time you can't also use military force that is disproportionate to accomplishing a military objective. Or that is indiscriminate in its application of violence, which would result in innocent civilians or non-combatants being killed. So again, you can't target, you can't use disproportionate force, you can't use indiscriminate force, and so civilians have to be protected. This is the hallmark of international humanitarian law. And yet, of course, nuclear weapons violates this to the nth degree. And in fact, all the legal rulings about nuclear weapons over the years have, basically come to this conclusion that even at the time the atomic bombs were dropped in Japan in 1945, international humanitarian law was extremely clear that could not happen, that this would be an extreme violation of the laws of war. And of course, continuing since then through the bombing campaigns of Vietnam and Korea, and on up, of course, to the current use of drones. Drones also violate international law. They kill innocent civilians. They are a disproportionate use of force at times, even though we claim that they are highly, able to target surgical strikes and can get the bad guys, the terrorists. But at the same time, we know that literally hundreds of innocent civilians have been killed by drone strikes. And of course, the definition of a terrorist or a resistor is extremely elastic to begin with, right?
Right.
So if I invade your country and you resist my invasion, that makes you a terrorist. I mean, in a sense, that's what we have in many of the situations here. So adding to the whole issue of criminality or state crimes committed for purposes of empire, we can add in the drone strike. So I'm very glad to see that the attention is going to be brought to this issue, and the march is going to come through and end up over in Battle Creek.
Yeah.
Well, Jerry, we just have 2 minutes left. Any final thoughts or reflections about any of the issues we've talked about? We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have covered a lot of ground today. Yeah.
So what kind of final thoughts do you want to leave us with?
I just have a response to what you were talking about bombing urban centers, I guess. World War II was won because of indiscriminate bombing
Right.
of cities. And, at some point, legally, morally, you have to take that into the equation, And when we're speaking about war, going forward, we're going to be talking about kind of the widespread destruction of human life, innocent human life, the life of non-combatants, that's what it means.
So therefore, the need to resist, right?
I think
The
so.
need to resist,
I
to
think
speak
so.
out, and that's what you're doing with the march and what Catholic worker movements do in general, and the Plowshares have done that eloquently. So, well, we're out of time, so thank you for joining us. And Jerry, thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you,
It was
Ron.
great.
Thanks
Pleasure
a
to
lot,
have you
Joe.
here.
Great job.
And we'll see you next time on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.